So let's start off by looking at how NASA went so wrong. And to understand this, we need to go back into history a bit. So back in the 1930s, 40s and 50s, there was a small group of idealists who thought that humanity's destiny was to go into space, and they built rockets to try and get there. And the most famous of them was Wernher von Braun in Germany, very keen rocket builder and great scientific pioneer. But building rockets was expensive, and he needed to get money somehow from governments to build these wonderful rockets that he hoped in the future would lead humanity to a future in space. And for a long time the government in question was Nazi Germany, and so they funded him to build rockets so they could put large amounts of explosive in the top and launch them at other countries to kill people. This is the V2 rocket, a technological marvel, but it's built by slave labour in Nazi prison camps and used to attack cities in England and the Netherlands. One of these landed at the end of the street where my father lived and blew out all his windows. Wernher von Braun probably didn't care too much. He just wanted to develop rocket technology, and if that's what it took, that's what it took. After the war, he ended up in the US and working on rockets, but the money wasn't enough to make spectacular progress. But then eventually something came up. The Sputnik panic. The Russians, the Soviet Union, managed to put a satellite, Sputnik 1, into Earth orbit. Now initially the US public and president weren't that fussed about this. Sure, we can do it sometime, no big deal. But people like Wernher von Braun saw their chance. They started a whole scare campaign. Oh my goodness, the Russians are ahead of us in space. This is going to destroy our reputation. We look up in space, we see a giant red star. They control the high ground. This is going to be a disaster. And the political opponents of the then government ran on from this. How come you let the Russians get ahead of us? So the scare got bigger and bigger and bigger, and people started freaking out and panicking. And some good came of this. It led to big reforms in the US education program, for example. But as part of the panic, the president at the time decided we need to have a space program. We need to spend lots of money. So Wernher von Braun got what he wanted. Lots of money, now with the purpose of beating the Soviet Union. And after 10 or more years of work, they succeeded. They built the Saturn V rocket and managed to land a few people on the moon. Fairly pointless by itself. I mean, sure, they did good science, but no one would have spent that much money to do their science. The money was spent to beat the Russians because politicians were embarrassed and they were panicking. Then by the time the landing actually happened, I think many people had lost interest in the whole thing. So they'd spent all this money, but it was very much a political process. They had to keep the political money going. And so lots of decisions were made with an eye to how do we keep the politicians willing to keep shoveling bucket loads of money in our direction so we can keep doing this. So the most important thing was that all parts of the rocket program spending large amounts of money is always popular with companies, and you carefully pick companies and corporations and organizations in key areas of the country with important senators or members of Congress. So the rockets are not built in one place, they're built all over the place, and a lot of these places that things are built are carefully designed to appeal to key senators who have important votes. So, for example, Barbara Mikulski was chair of the Appropriations Committee. She's responsible for money, so she gets NASA's the centre that operates the Hubble Space Telescope. It's in her constituency. Mission Control is not at the Cape, it's in Houston because that was Lyndon Johnson's constituency, and so on. And so before long you're spending large amounts of money on high-paying salaries to people to build rocket components all over the country in key constituencies, so all the members of Congress for those areas are going to fight hard to keep it. Then you lobby government carefully, you have a strong public relations machine, and another rule is that nothing must ever go wrong. You can't, for example, try things out. Let's say we've got to figure out how this rocket works, so we'll launch 25 of them and slowly get the bugs out. No, because anytime one goes wrong, people in government are going to say, oh, that blew up, maybe we'll cut your budget. So you've got to make sure it works first time, even though it might be far more efficient to launch lots of these things and get the bugs out slowly and let a few of them explode, as long as they're unmanned. Or anything with humans on has to work first time, of course. But when you're designing a new car or something, you do a lot of trial and error. You try different designs, see what works and so on, but you're not allowed to do that here. It has to work first time, because any failures, even if they're failures in the cause of later success, bad publicity, excuse for someone in Congress to cancel your money. So after they got to the moon, what do they do now? All this money, they built this thing so carefully that they couldn't just cut off funding. Everyone got used to Americans in space, so they had to do something else. But there was no particular purpose. They beat the Russians, that was the real purpose. So, let's build a reusable rocket. So they built the space shuttle, which actually wasn't reusable because almost every part of it had to be rebuilt between every launch, and it actually cost 3 times more than the old Saturn V to payload into space. So actually it was a disaster, and it was dangerous. 2 of them blew up and killed their crew. So it's a dangerous, unreliable, hideously expensive monstrosity. But it kept people spending money in marginal constituencies. It kept Americans in space, so it served its purpose. But given you've got this incredibly expensive thing, what are you going to do with it? Well, we're going to have the International Space Station, and the purpose of the International Space Station is to justify the space shuttle. Sure, it does science, but you could have done the science a lot cheaper. And if you list the top 100 scientific results from the last 50 years, I don't think any one of the top 100 came from the International Space Station. Maybe one of them, but something that's had hundreds of billions of dollars spent on it, the scientific payoff is extremely low. But the purpose of this is to justify this, which is to justify all that expenditure in key marginal constituencies. So of course the cost blew out. Spending money was the entire point. That's what NASA is for. It's for spending money in marginal constituencies to buy votes. Huge running costs, not a problem. That's all money being spent in marginal constituencies. The aerospace companies like it, and they are very good at lobbying for these things. Particularly, they get these wonderful things called cost-plus contracts. Instead of NASA giving a contract, it will cost you $2 billion to launch 5 rockets, they'll say, we'll give you $2 billion plus whatever you spend and build a rocket when you can. Now, the rationale for this is that this is research. You're trying to develop new things, and for new things it's very hard to control the price. So I kind of see why they did this. It's very hard to predict how much something radically new is going to cost. But the net result is the incentive for the developer is the longer it takes and the more it costs, the more money we get. And this has been disastrous. The budgets have blown out because basically the company has no incentive to save money. In fact, every incentive to do the reverse. The most recent example, they've got this metal frame which the SLS launches besides. This one isn't quite big enough for the Block 2 SLS, so they're building a new one. It's now expected to cost $2.7 billion, the price having gone up by more than about a factor of almost 10, which is double the price of the biggest building in the world, which is far taller. So it's absolutely ridiculous price. SpaceX can build their launch pads for under $50 million. So the costs blow out, the incentives are wrong, but this kept on going for decade after decade. It's